Mark Azalea is an industry leader in psychotherapy and men's mental health. He's helped countless guys get back on their feet, deepen their relationships, and excel in their lives. Now he's taken all that he has learned and is sharing it with you. In each episode, Mark will interview an expert in the field of masculinity and men's work. We'll cover topics such as emotional intelligence, masculine identity, anger management, financial health, trauma recovery, marriage and divorce, ethics, and spirituality. Tune in and become a better man.
Welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm here with returning guest Melissa Barbash. Melissa, welcome back.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So you were a guest on From the Ashes, I think like 2 or 3 times. So it's awesome that you're on the new show.
Yes, I know. I'm excited to see what it's all about. I've listened to talked to a couple people, but I'm excited to see what it's all about.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the same thing. It's just the same thing, but I'm just like focusing more kind of on men's issues and working with men specifically. I think From the Ashes was more of like personal stories of guests, which are valuable. But what I got feedback from is that the listeners wanted more kind of value for them, right? More kind of education and understanding. And with the rebrand of Men's Therapy Online, I figured it's a good opportunity to kind of do it all in one.
Is your demographic people who like identify as cisgender male or people who identify as men? Is it primarily younger men, older men? I just want to kind of, you might not have that breakdown, but I kind of wanted to understand that a little bit better.
We have some of that. I mean, I think it's primarily cisgendered men. Okay. We tend to have, it tends to be skewed like 25 to 55 was what we're seeing.
Okay.
We do have a couple guests lined up. They're going to talk more about the queer experience. And I think that's an important part of it, right? Because it's not a binary, and it's like, masculinity and maleness is changing rapidly and people can take that label on. So we're not excluding that. In fact, there'll be some couple episodes I'm really excited about in the future that will dive directly into that. But from our data, it's mostly cisgendered men in America.
Okay. That's helpful. Just kind of helpful with my topic and also just for future reference too, kind of to know where the podcast is going or who's going to be on and kind of what the experience will be like.
Yeah. And to be clear, right, with you and the listeners, like I'm interviewing, men and women and all kinds of people, right? Like the focus is on male listeners, but there's a lot of value, right, everywhere. And this brings me kind of like why I wanted you on, because I know you work a lot with women, right? Women in heterosexual relationships with men, right? Oftentimes those men are addicts or they suffer from mental illness and the women are trying to cope with that, right? And work through that. And I see that so often in therapy, right? It's like the guy doesn't go to therapy, right? Doesn't go to help and the partner ends up in therapy. And you're kind of doing like therapy for the guy through the partner. And it's like, we both know that's not effective at all.
Yeah, it's not. And I do end up with a lot of folks too, whose spouses, quote unquote, want them to go to therapy. So they're there to see how I can help them please their spouse too. So it's like kind of interchangeable from both perspectives. But yeah, I'd love to see more men getting some support.
Yeah, me too, right? I mean, that's kind of like what this show is about, is hopefully inspiring guys to go to therapy. And not to be something of like, go there and get fixed, right? It's like trying to understand, like talk and like, figure out like who you are and what your part is and what do you bring to a relationship.
How can you be happy? How can you identify whether or not you are?
Right. Pretty good questions. So we chatted briefly about fathers, right? And I think, I was thinking about focusing in on partners, and I think we will probably get there too, but I think fathers is a really awesome topic of, the kind of intergenerational piece, because it's not just, a daughter with their dad. It's also a generational difference. It's a, cultural difference. So dive right into that. I mean, what are you seeing kind of in your therapy room as it relates to daughters and fathers?
Well, I would like to talk about partners too, so we can hold that for whenever we talk about that. So that's a good idea also if we get to it. I see a lot of dysfunction in relationships between, I'm going to say a lot of daughters, but children and their fathers, and a lot of separation and this idea that they want, the people that I work with want something to be better, want some sort of conversation, want some sort of emotional experience with their father before that's too late. And I see a lot of fixing themselves or taking the onus on how to change those relationships. And I do think that the parent has a lot of responsibility in looking at how they've impacted their children. And I understand that it can be really hard to do that. I just can't imagine so many of the fathers out there are, when they get to the end of their life, satisfied with their relationships with their children. So I think it's really important for fathers of any age, right? So someone who may be entering fatherhood right now to know what's going on inside them so they don't turn to addiction, so they don't turn to silence, so they don't tell their child not to express emotion, so they can start from there. And then the older generation trying to repair that also. So I see kind of both areas.
Yeah. So what do you think? There's a lot there. Like, I want to back up to fathers. Like, what do you think happens there? Because I've had the experience, and I imagine you have, where you're working with a client, right? And they do this, they try to do this big reconciliation. Like maybe they write this powerful letter, right? Or they, have like the sit down talk, or even like you said, on the deathbed, right? They're like, okay, what am I going to say to my dad before he dies? Like, I want it to be really meaningful. And I've seen like, I want to put a number on it, but I would say like 80% of those just fail, like spectacularly, right? Like the person does this big reveal they've worked on for months sometimes. And then like the dad is there and they're like, that's great. Yeah. Like, what's for dinner? Like just like total dismissal. What do you think that's about?
I try to set clients up to know that a big reveal is not going to change the human in front of you. Because I think that they go in really hoping that all the work that they've done will change the person in front of them. I don't want it to be a big reveal. I'd like it to be kind of like over time, because a big reveal is just filled with hopelessness, because you do all of this work and then you go in to try to talk with the person and then you get the same thing that you always get, because of course you do. That person hasn't been doing their work. They're not expecting this big reveal, and why are they going to act any differently? So I see that all the time, this hopefulness, like if I just talk to him in this particular way, or if I bring it up in this way, he'll change and he'll love me and he'll treat me differently. And it doesn't happen that way, though. It's just they're often moving towards someone that doesn't have those skills. So I hate building up someone's hopes like that. I try to say that you're actually working on changing how you experience your father. If you can't convince him to work with you in this, I know sometimes on these shows I ask you if that makes sense. So sometimes when I just think out loud, I don't know if it lands as sensical.
It is sensical.
Is that a word?
It is. Yeah, it's highly sensical.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing, and maybe like it's that you don't want to set people up for disappointment, right? And when they do this big reveal, it's kind of unreasonable to expect that it's going to just like completely change their dad's personality, or completely like be the silver bullet that's going to cut through everything.
No, I can't cut through shame and like years of their own trauma or their experience that they wanted with someone else, or a fantasy that they have. It just can't cut through all of that. And nor should they be doing all of the work to try to do that, because it's not their job to be a therapist to their parents. And I understand that therapy is much more acceptable now, and less stigmatized. And I would just really love to see like men in their 50s and 60s face some hard demons, I think, in order to themselves be satisfied relationally. It can't be fun. It can't be a fulfilling life to know that the person like that you've birthed has so many negative feelings towards you, or doesn't feel like you have a relationship. That can't feel good.
Yeah. I mean, I have two things to say. I think that's the question I have, Melissa. And I'm curious really what you think about this, because I don't have an answer. Like, this is an open question of that generation, specifically men. Like, do they have an emotional world that we're not aware of? I think as a therapist, I want to say yes. Or is it something where they're like literally not capable of it? And as a human, I want to say no, right? Because when I think of my own dad, and I love my dad. We have a great relationship, and he doesn't seem to have the same emotional depth that I do. Mm-hmm. And the way that I've worked with my therapist to frame that is this idea that like, he's actually so good at providing and doing the immigrant experience, which he had to go through, and building like a foundation for our family. Like, so much of his life was specced into that. Yeah. They didn't get to develop the emotional stuff. And actually the fact that he was so good at the physical logistical things is he has a son that now has emotional needs, mm-hmm. right? Like, the foundation was there to have a son with emotional needs. And then when I want to connect with him emotionally, it's like a wall. And there's like something very tragic about that, right? Like, if he was kind of like less good at being a provider, then I would have to be more of a provider, and we could connect, I think, more, right? Because we'd be in that same kind of like logistical survival state, you know?
I hear what you're saying about like cultural experiences and, you know, intergenerational experiences, and that men and women have had to hold like specific roles. I think that it's very sad that they're only allowed to hold one particular role, because I don't think that people don't have the capacity. I just think that they have honed a particular side of themselves that was necessary to help like their children function in a particular way and to protect themselves. But I don't think that means that they don't have that other part. I just don't know if they had the luxury to nurture it.
Yeah,
I guess like we do. I think we have a little bit more ability to nurture those pieces, all of our pieces, whereas I'm sure, and I think men at some time didn't have that. They weren't taught that, and they didn't have that space to do that necessarily. I think what I want is to say, like, there's that space now in the world. And I want them to be able to utilize both parts of themselves, all parts, provider, father, mentor, crier, whatever it is. So I mean, my father is also not somebody that you can kind of contact emotionally. It's very difficult, but I actually think it's in there because he can do it with other people. So I've actually asked other people if he, you know, what kind of emotional experience they have with him. And I know he's always been kind of harder to attach to for most people in my life. And I also know that he's capable because I've seen it. I just don't see it with my sister and I. So I think that some people can function in the world amongst their peers, but when it comes to their children, something happens that they kind of like see their children stuck in this moment in time and like treat them that way for the rest of their lives. I don't know. I'm rambling now, but I have a lot of thoughts about this.
No, keep going on that. Yeah. Like what do you think happens with the family relationship? Because I think that's true. I think it's true. I think, yeah, specifically for older men, where like they can often be like better fathers to people that are further away from them. Right?
Yeah.
They're like further out of the rings in their connection.
Yes, exactly. They can like take care of other people in a different way, or other people can convince them somehow to, like, I have family members that can somehow convince my father to say more about what he's feeling. Mm-hmm. But my sister and I are just like fucking banging our heads against the wall, you know, slowly. So we start to wonder, well, there's the capacity. What's the distance here then? So I find that very interesting. Can you ask me your question again? I lost my place.
Oh yeah. No, the question is that, right? It's like, what do you think the barrier is with children specifically? The barrier to emotional intimacy, emotional connection.
Okay.
You're saying, they kind of get stuck in time is what.
Yeah. Well, particularly like with divorce.
Yeah.
I think, I'll just say statistically speaking, if it's not shared custody, fathers get less custody more often than not. And I think see their children in this time frame of this particular age. And they have some limited time to get to know them, and maybe they want limited time to get to know them. I don't know everybody's situation. Some people don't fight for custody. So I guess my question is, can men come forward and say, I really don't like this relationship that I have with my child. And I have to look at my part. And that's going to hurt. And it will hurt the child too. But is that so much better than living such a lonely existence? And I know that the answer for a lot of people is no, that pain and shame and all of that is not better. But I'm an advocate for dialogue and talk, and I think it is better. For anybody that I work with, at least from anything that I've heard. They just want, if it's anger, if it's any sort of emotion, it doesn't matter what emotion it is, just some sort of contact in the emotional realm.
Yeah, they just want realness, right? I mean, I think as children, and all of us are children, we want to know our parents. We want to really know them and feel them and be connected to them and try to get beyond the role.
Yeah. And I mean, you have to know yourself well enough to be able to teach your child how to sort through their emotions. So all of your shit is just going to go on to them if you don't work it out a little bit more. Like your fears of crying and anger, and it's just going to go on to them. So why don't we start chopping away at that if we can?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to move to our commercial break. There's a lot more there, but I agree with you completely. I think it's this is speaking to the men that are listening, I think it's a very heroic thing to do, truly. And a very paternal, leadership, strong thing to do. I'm using male language here, but it's the most brave thing to do is to face these demons and slay them and make sure they don't get passed down to your children. Because that, what kind of gift is that? Talk about being a provider. That's the biggest thing you can provide is breaking that cycle that you may have, and I'm sure your dad may have, and his dad may have, and it goes all the way back right up that paternal line. So breaking that is really powerful. I mean, really truly actually life changing.
Yeah. I know we're going to commercial, but maybe consider the thought, do I want my daughter to end up with a man who's emotionally like me? Because that might happen. So I know that's a hard question, but it happens. And yeah, all right, I'll just say
happens more often than not. So we're going to go to our commercial break, and when we come back, we'll just pick right back up.
Okay.
Follow Voice America at facebook.com/Voice America for juicy updates from your favorite radio shows and podcasts.
Men's Therapy Online is now accepting new members. Men's Therapy Online offers a solution to the lack of outlets for emotional expression, positive role models, and access to meaningful milestone experiences. In our post-COVID world, loneliness is at an all-time high. Men need consistent community. Our society is rapidly changing. Old models of masculinity are falling at the task of promoting emotional intelligence and meaningful connection. Men's Therapy Online offers tools and experiences designed to help the man who is struggling to balance traditional male roles and emotional fluidity. Whether you need to get back on your feet or take your life to the next level, Men's Therapy Online has your back. We help our members become a true 21st century man, a man who is not burdened by the rapid change of society, but who contributes to it honorably. If you're interested in signing up and finding your band of brothers, go to menstherapy.online to learn more. That's menstherapy.online. Start your journey today.
It's your world. Motivate, change, succeed. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
You are listening to the Men's Therapy Podcast with Mark Azalea. To reach the show today, please call 1-888-346-9141. That's 1-888-346-9141. Or send an email to podcast@menstherapy.online or visit www.menstherapypodcast.com. Now, back to the Men's Therapy Podcast.
Welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. So I'm here with Melissa Barbash, and we're talking about father-daughter relationships. And we were just chatting a little bit over the break, and I'm happy, Melissa, that you feel similar to me, where I think the therapy industry can like shrink it down and say like parent-child. But I do think father-daughter is different from, mother-son, different from, father-son, or, mother-daughter. I think each one has their own unique, nuanced kind of feeling to it. So I'm curious, for the father-daughter, for the scope of this episode, what would you say would make that relationship unique?
Well, I guess I'd have to start with culturally in our society, women typically are kind of doing more in the parenting relationship on the home front. I don't want to generalize that completely. And I know that there's evidence of that. So I don't want to say that it's actually research based.
Yeah,
so
I think women typically are primary caregivers in a relationship.
Yes,
typically.
Yes. And can fulfill a lot of roles, sometimes due to biological pieces, like they're predisposed to kind of being more available when a child cries. So I think that fathers are going in with a disadvantage. So I think they have to do a little bit more to bring themselves into the relationship. That's the first thing I'm thinking of. The second thing I'm thinking of is giving daughters this message that, like, you're just a provider, or you can come to me for anything that you need, but kind of emotions are off limits. I think gives them a skewed version of attachment. And a lot of the people that I work with end up in relationships with absent partners, and come to therapy to heal those relationships, when really one of the primary relationships they need to heal is with their parent, with their father. And so typically, because the father is unwilling to do that or not available to do that, they end up healing that with their relationship, this one or the next one or the next one or the next one. And so it would really be helpful if, the one of the caregivers was part of the conversation, so that this person doesn't feel like she is just stuck engaging in the same behavior over and over again because she's a bad child, or rambling again, but that's kind of where my mind is going.
Yeah. I think, to just reiterate it, say in a different way, right, is like, I think the daughter patterns their relationships over their father because of that unmet, right? So if their father was emotionally shut down, in your example, they're going to find emotionally shut down partners because they want it to be different with their dad, right?
Yeah.
And they might try to fix it. Strategies.
Yeah. Try to fix that pain through a partnership.
Right? And they're going to self-select people where that probably also isn't possible, right? So even though they're trying to heal it, oftentimes people end up just repeating that trauma over and over again.
Right. Exactly. So I don't want to give the message that out there to fathers that you need to be perfect, or like your daughter's going to find someone terrible. But repair goes such a long way, and talking about anything about yourself and any type of emotion that you have, or hearing your child's emotions, like, it goes such a long way into helping them feel more secure in life. And I think that that's one of the primary reasons you bring a child into the world, is to love them and help them grow. So why not help them grow in a way that's really beneficial?
Yeah. I mean, something that I want to share to the male listeners, which I think as men, it's really hard for us to understand because we're conditioned so differently. Mm-hmm. Right. But women have this thing, which is primarily a result of oppression, quite frankly, of always blaming themselves. Mm-hmm. Right. Like if a relationship is going wrong, it's often the woman's fault, or the woman feels as though it's their fault. They're not good enough. They didn't say the right thing. They don't love their partner enough. They don't have the right answer. Like they really, really personalize stuff in a way that men, I don't think we really do, because we're conditioned to get mad at the world. Right. Mm-hmm. Like as a man, you're like, oh, that person's an asshole, or that person fucked up, or, F them. And we just like leave and find someone new. Right. Like we're trained to externalize and women are trained to internalize. Mm-hmm. And, something that I've had to learn being in relationships with women is that, one, that fact, and two, which is even more important, that like I cannot understand. I like really can understand the amount of internalization that women go through because I'm not a woman. Mm-hmm. And it's like, just imagine the most shame that you've ever felt and just like double it and double it and double it and double it and double it. Right. Like women live with an unbelievable amount of like personal shame and fear and all that. And, I think y'all do your work, which is great to like start to get empowered and liberated from that. But it is like a very, very real thing that again, I don't think men get, like, because of our conditioning, and maybe biology is different too, but certainly the conditioning is really different around this particular topic.
Yes. I mean, what I see is just women working so hard to try to find these answers. Like, how can I stop doing this? How can I get this person to do this better? Like and I know that's like oppressive training. Like, I know that is like, work harder, you'll find the answers. And they're just exhausted. All they want is someone to kind of come into the mix with them and just take a little bit of that ownership. But they'll keep working themselves to death. I mean, they'll keep coming and trying and trying and trying. And I guess it's off the topic of fathers, but doesn't mean that the people I'm talking about are not fathers. But I also think it's really important that when you were saying that, like, I don't know what you were saying. Anyway, I also think it's really important that when people go to couples work, that not just the woman is in her own therapy. And that happens a lot of the time, primarily due to like fears, and also kind of, there's a lot of probably rightful excuses around needing to provide and not taking the time away from work. And it just ends up leaving the woman to feel responsible. Like, oh, okay, so the couples therapist is recommending that we both go to our treatment. I will be the rule follower and the diligent one and go do that, but you don't have to. So it reinforces the idea that something's wrong with them, the women. And I do hear that maybe that's too difficult for men to look at. But it makes the couples therapy so much slower too. So if you want to heal your relationship quicker, I think that's a really good idea. I personally don't often recommend couples therapy to my clients without having some kind of affirmation that their partner is also in their own treatment, because what ends up happening a lot of the times is utilizing the couples work to kind of help the male learn about his emotions. And that takes a lot of time, and it takes away from the actual relational component.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it can also just double down the disconnection, right? Yeah. If you have someone in the room that's very emotionally intelligent and interested in somebody who hasn't done that yet, right? Mm-hmm. It just like just creates more moments for misattunement,
Yeah. I'd like some feedback on if it feels like I'm bashing any men out there, because that's not my intention, but it might be received that way. So I'm curious to know if it feels that way. I'm trying to figure out if I'm moving into that shame spiral that you were talking about.
You might be. I mean, they can let us know. Email podcast@menstherapy.online with your feedback. No, like I think so. So I'm doing a presentation. This is a side note, but I think it's relevant. I'm doing a presentation. That's why we rescheduled and we're pre-recording this episode. So thank you. Thank you on air for that. That's for the CCA, and it's about modern masculinity, right? And it's about therapy. Specifically, it's the audience is with therapists. And fast forward all the way to the end, one of the points I'm making is that in therapy, women need safety, but men need respect, right? And I think like the conversation, the more direct it can be, it's actually respect, right? I think from like a male perspective, telling it to us straight, being honest, like coming at it with compassion, which I hear of like being like, yeah, like do this work. It'll help your daughter, it'll help your wife, it'll help your partner. Like that's compassion. But I think like as men, we want that. I mean, when I talk to dudes and I say like, hey, what would be effective as with me as your therapist? They always say like almost 9 times out of 10, they say, call me on my bullshit. Right. So like, I think what you're feeling is that conditioning, right? Is that like, don't challenge men. Men are emotionally fragile. Men like can't take it. I'm telling you directly, like we can take it. In fact, like we need to take it, right? Like we need more women like you that are able to say like, do this shit, show up, like be a hero, look at your emotions. Like we need that thrown in our face, right? Because I do think men grow through challenge, right? And I think like that's a challenge is like, you might think that you're like too man enough to go to therapy, but it might be that you're not man enough to go to therapy, right? Like it might be fear, and there's no shame about having fear. The therapist is there to help you work through your fear. Yeah. But you have to take the first step of picking up the phone and making an appointment, right? Like we can't do that as therapists. We can't force you to do any of this. Yeah. I don't want your fear to limit your relationships. Yeah, like that's what ends up happening. And I don't know the retention for you with men in your practice, but there's a lot of good retention, and then there's also some just kind of disappearance, giving up, doesn't feel good, but can't say that it doesn't feel good or there's something they don't like. So I really want that. Like, go see Mark, he'll show up. See him, like, please keep showing up. That's really all I think I want. Keep showing up. Yeah. I mean, the guys that I see, and we have a gender difference, obviously, so it might be different. What we see, but like the guys that I see that most of them do retain, but the guys that fall off is actually like the nice guy performer guys, like the, compliant resistance would be kind of like the term for it, right? The guy that like shows up, has nothing wrong, like actually like speaks the therapy language, like tries to be like the best client, tries to like explain themselves before they even get there, but there's no emotion, right? They're like, oh yeah, like I got this figured out. Like, let me just like walk you through this process that I already did and rehearsed in the car on the way here, right? Like there's no actual connection. They're just like performative vulnerability and performative therapy. Yeah. And I try to call that out. And I think when that gets challenged, it can be really difficult because like that thing has worked. And I think it's worked with their partners too, right? Because like a lot of guys, especially in the Boulder, Denver area, like we're a liberal place, like therapy language is out there. Like people have watched the TED Talks, right? Like they can do a pretty good show. Yeah. But I'll tell you guys, right? Like your women know, women in your life know, because they're not listening to your words, they're listening to your feelings. And like, you can hit them with like the best fucking speech and the best thing that you're like, oh man, nailed it. Yeah. But like, if it's flat, and it will be because it's not real, like they know. Yes. And they'll try to chase you for them. I know you're angry. Yeah. I know you're sad. I know you're feeling this way. It's probably, very annoying, but it's, we are very intuitive with emotions, particularly if we had fathers that didn't talk about them. We had to guess, and then we are typically right about what we're seeing. Yeah, I think y'all know. I mean, you're tapped into stuff again because of training, and I think this is also biological difference. This shows up in research where women are way more attentive to tone of voice and pace of speech and micro expressions. Like your brains and perception is like hardwired to notice like all those like little moments that guys we're so much more literal, right? So we're like, oh yeah, well, like I told her I was angry, and it's like, yeah, but did you get angry? Right? Or like I told her I was sad, but like, did you cry? Like where's like that nonverbal piece? Yeah, I'm sad. Right. I'm really sad that this happened, and I'm angry at you, but you know what? I think I thought about it and I figured it out, and we're just gonna change this. We're just gonna change this piece, and it's gonna be fine, and we're gonna be good. Right. Like, yeah. It's so isolating. And I say this because I've done this, right? Like it cuts the partner out of their relationship completely. Mm-hmm. Right. When you tell them, you walk them through the whole story and then you give them a solution and you say like, I already got it all figured out. Like there's zero relationship in that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like saying in the room, it sounds like you don't need me for this. You've got the questions, the answers, and the whole, like you got it worked out. And I'm just going to sit back and hang out here. But it's very interesting. I think it sparked this idea that, so my dog went to the ER the other night. And so my partner has a learning disability, but I don't actually think that plays into this. Sometimes he wonders. But I actually think like the awareness that you're talking about, like the awareness of the world, like that there's not that level of awareness in a lot of men. And so, I was telling the vet, well, his tongue was redder than usual and his pupils are dilated. And my partner's like, what are you talking about? Like, I heard him whimper, that I heard, and he was pacing. Like, those are the things that he noticed. But I was like, no, this is going on. He's picking this foot up, so it's just interesting that you were saying kind of the differences. I know I'm using a dog as a reference, but I think it's a kind of hitting on.
Oh, no, that's it. I mean, there's like an insane amount of research that I find super fascinating of just that. Like when you like show like a movie, right? And then you ask a man versus a woman to recall what they remember. It's exactly that. And the woman will talk about the characters and like, their relationship to each other and what they're saying and like the tone of voice. Mm-hmm. And the men are more aware of like the objects in the room or like what the scene was or like in general, kind of like where it's happening and the context for it. Right. And like the shorthand is like, women live in a world of people and men live in a world of things. And there's room for both. Like one is not better than the other, but like those are what you just talked about with the dog. Like that is real. And that is, I don't think it's learned disability. That's just like gender differences.
I think so.
Like that's just, we're different creatures. Men and women are different,
Exactly. So I wasn't annoyed about that. I get annoyed about other things. But we have a minute. Is that, I can't.
Yes. Yeah. We just got a commercial. Okay. Yeah. Throw something in there.
I think when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about what it's like to have your like spouse nurture you rather than a therapist, and how that's going to get old, and they're going to get mad at you a lot. Women are going to get annoyed with having to be the one to nurture you and not having someone else there to do it.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that because I'm the opposite, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, my partner, Caroline, right? And like, I've always had therapists nurture me and I struggle to have my partner nurture me. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a good conversation because I think there's like two sides to this coin.
Yeah.
Right. The answer is like, it's somewhere in the middle, but yes, when we get back from the commercial break, we'll chat more about nurturance and what that might look like.
Voice America is on LinkedIn. Connect with us today.
Men's Therapy Online is now accepting new members. Men's Therapy Online offers a solution to the lack of outlets for emotional expression, positive role models, and access to meaningful milestone experiences. In our post-COVID world, loneliness is at an all-time high. Men need consistent community. Our society is rapidly changing. Old models of masculinity are falling at the task of promoting emotional intelligence and meaningful connection. Men's Therapy Online offers tools and experiences designed to help the man who is struggling to balance traditional male roles and emotional fluidity. Whether you need to get back on your feet or take your life to the next level, Men's Therapy Online has your back. We help our members become a true 21st century man. A man who is not burdened by the rapid change of society, but who contributes to it honorably. If you're interested in signing up and finding your band of brothers, go to menstherapy.online to learn more. That's menstherapy.online. Start your journey today.
It's your world. Motivate, change, succeed. VoiceAmericaEmpowerment.com.
You are listening to the Men's Therapy Podcast with Mark Azalea. To reach the show today, please call 1-888-346-9141. That's 1-888-346-9141. Or send an email to podcast@menstherapy.online or visit www.menstherapypodcast.com. Now, back to the Men's Therapy Podcast.
Welcome back to the show, Men's Therapy Podcast. We're in this final segment here. We're going to talk about nurturance and kind of both sides of the coin of being nurtured by a therapist versus being nurtured by your partner, and what each of those poles look like and how to find kind of a middle ground. Because I guess what I would start off, and I'm curious, Melissa, what you think about this. You might have difference of opinion. I think a lot of men struggle being nurtured at all, right? Like I think we're conditioned to think that we're all alone and that the cavalry isn't coming and we have to do everything by ourselves. You know, as I'm praying for this presentation, right? I just got this stat where in America, it's crazy. 39% of men self-identify as being lonely and identify as that if they had an emergency, nobody would be able to help them. 39%. And that's self-identification, which means it's probably higher because some guys probably wouldn't say that on a survey.
The cynical part of me goes to, well, do they have that available and nobody taught them how to ask for it? Or do they also have really unloving relationships and don't have that? So my mind goes to both of those questions. As you can see, I can never be solely compassionate. Not never. It's solely compassionate. I get, I have lots of questions behind everything. I can be
I think a lot of it's self-isolation, right? Like, I don't think it's entirely true, but it's like they feel as though, again, if they had an emergency, no one would be there for them. That might be false, but they certainly feel that way, or they're reporting that they feel that way.
Say it. Yeah, self-isolation. That's a good way to say it.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking about what you said, and I was wondering if there's a difference between someone being in recovery and utilizing their therapist for nurturing, and someone who's not really utilizing anybody for that, but the person that they can rely on the most is their spouse. And rely on meaning not to nurture, but to kind of save or forgive or teach them about emotions. So, I kind of wondered if there was a difference between kind of like my clientele and someone who's in recovery. I don't know that that's only it, but that's where my mind went.
Yeah, good question. I think being in recovery, working with people in recovery, we've certainly been exposed to therapists, whereas I think a lot of guys haven't even had a therapist ever. Most guys, right, have never worked with a therapist.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think speaking from my experience, like I had a parent that was very like emotionally intrusive, and their emotions like dominated our space. So I think as a kid, I made this vow to myself that I would never be that. Right. Like my emotions would never dominate a space. I would never like derail something because I'm having a bad day. Like I would just kind of like do nice guy stuff. Right. Okay. So for me, having a therapist, that's quite frankly that I pay for, right? Like that, like I pay them to just listen to me, and I pay them to like not inject their own stuff. And I pay them to kind of pay my own guilt away of being emotional. Like, oh, like I'm doing this service. So like, it's okay for me to be emotional and to like complain or to like kind of get this stuff out. That was really, really helpful for me. Like I needed that container to kind of overcome that vow. Yeah. And I still struggle with this idea of like, I remember being proud of this, of like, I'm like, yeah, I have a therapist so that I don't burden you guys with my emotional shit. Like I would tell my friends that, I tell my girlfriends that, right? That like, I'm a catch. Because I'm not going to like complain. I'm not going to ask you to nurture me because like I already have this other person that does that. Now that I'm a little older and mature, like that can be detrimental to my relationship because it's disconnecting, right? I mean, it cuts Caroline out of our conversations. And that's kind of what we're actively working on right now is figuring out what even nurturance like looks like, A long-winded answer to your question.
No, it's making me think about, saying more about my experience. And I guess I'm thinking of like a spouse or a partner of someone who's not in recovery, who's actively using or actively struggling with an addiction of some kind. And the relationship becomes very dependent on the primary person in it for any kind of functioning, really, or maintenance of relationships, keeping someone alive sometimes. Like there's a lot that goes into, holding secrets. And so there's a lot that goes into that. And most of the people that I work with, and myself included, have like begged the people that they're with to go talk to somebody. And so that, I'm going to use your words, so that the burden is not on one person. And I think we'd be open to them, quote unquote, burdening anybody other than just one person. But those other people can't help. So that's why we say therapist, like go do this with the therapist and then come talk to me about it. I don't want you not to burden me with your emotions. But I want to be in a relationship with you. I don't want to be your person that helps you solve this necessarily, because then what happens to me in that? So I understand what you're saying also. Like I grew up in a house where I contained a lot and could take care of a lot of other people. So I could do that. So I got to my breaking point and I'm like, go talk to someone. And so I'm sure I got a little colder in that. Cold, I don't like that word. I got a little less, I got more resistant to being the person that someone could just come to for everything. I don't want to be that person. And I don't, when I'm working with people who are new to recovery, I'm also very specific that I can't be their only person. Like you have to be part of a program. You have to be part of a group. You have to have a sponsor. It doesn't matter if it's one or all of those. It's just something else. Because addicts tend to whittle down their support system to one person. And whether that's their spouse or their therapist, it happens. And it's not a good place to be for them or for the person in relationship with them.
Totally. Yeah. And I think addiction is a different case.
Yeah.
Right. Because where I go with it is different podcast topic, but it's like, it's so regressive, like when I think of some kind of classic addiction behavior, the one that comes to mind is when an addict will often like relapse and then make it their partner's fault. Right. Like you made me do this. You made me drink. You made me use. Right. Or make it their therapist's fault. Yeah. Or like this attention seeking, mostly unconscious, but still real, like attention seeking behavior. Right. Like, or wanting to get caught. Right. Like leaving the beer bottles in a place that like, of course your wife is going to find them. Right. Like there's so much like really regressive, like really young things there. Yeah. Around caregiver, around like, see me, notice me, love me, right? Like, love me no matter what, right? Like, pick up after me, right? Like, take care of me. Like, it's really infantilizing. And I think what you're saying is completely apt, right? Like, I think your partner, their partner doesn't want to be their mom, right? Like, doesn't want to be their caregiver. I mean, it's not sexy. I think the relationship dies off. It loses a lot of respect. And then that person, that caregiver that I know you work with, like can feel trapped and feel responsible and feel like they have to save this person.
Yeah. And it doesn't work. And it's just a recipe for disaster. And all of the things that you're saying are things I think are valuable to teach to men. I don't think that I'm going to say everybody doesn't realize that, but since we're talking about men in particular, I don't think that a lot of men know that that's what they're doing, that they're regressing, or why they're regressing, or what they're trying to ask for in that moment. And how they're not going to get what they want by doing that in the long run. In the short term, yes, they're going to orchestrate something to get what they need and what they want, but they're just going to continue this cycle of unhappiness. Yeah, I know I moved it to addiction, but it feels like such a big part of
the same thing.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to kind of, like oppression, right? And I think male privilege, right? Like I think a lot of men don't get challenged, and they don't get challenged as boys. Again, in doing this research presentation, I got so many of these interesting facts. Another one is that I don't have the numbers in front of me, but women in school, in kindergarten, right, are corrected. Their behavior is corrected. I want to say it's almost 3 or 4 times more often than male behavior is corrected, right? And the other interesting wrinkle to that is that the teachers that are correcting male behavior are female teachers. If you actually have a male teacher in early education, which is rare, but when there's a male teacher, it actually is way closer to 50-50. And it's, again, the reason that the research puts forth is it's this oppression factor of like women are taught not to challenge men, right? They're taught not to call them out. They're taught not to like scold them, right? So you have a male child who's been throwing temper tantrums since he's been 5. And he's still throwing temper tantrums when he's 45.
Yes.
Because the women in his life, and it's not women's fault. Like this is oppression. I want to make that really clear to our female listeners too, right? Like it's not your fault. Like there's oppressive messages that says like, do not challenge the men in your life. Do not call them out. Do not stop them. Like just like they are an unmovable pillar, and you have to like operate around them instead of asking them to move and change. Yeah. And a lot of guys, like we also suffer from that, right? Like in the short term, like I said, it could feel really good to be that unmovable pillar and to get what you want, but like you're also rigid, and also everybody hates you, right? Like you're like behind closed doors, they're talking about you, right? Behind closed doors, you're not as powerful as you might feel in that moment. It's a really lonely, isolating place to be, and you never learn how to dance. You never learn how to change and move and grow and actually relate. Yeah,
I think that's true. I was thinking about 2 things. I recently listened to this podcast by Kara Swisher. I don't know if you know who she is, but anyway, she interviewed Gina Davis, and Gina Davis was talking about how there was like never another female cast movie other than A League of Their Own about like women in sports. And they were like, yeah, we already made that movie. So anyway, it was really interesting for anybody who wants to listen to it. She was very interesting and talked about like this idea of what shows are shown to children when they're younger, and how women or girls watch all the boys shows, and then the boys stop watching the girls shows when they reach a certain age. And so they're not like exposed to that as much anymore. And then the other thing I was thinking of was when I worked in a treatment center and I had only male bosses, and I said I was volunteering like in one capacity when I worked in the other also, just to help. And I said, this is getting to be too much. I'm here. Like, I can't do my job and volunteer here. Like, you need to fill this position. And the response was, you should really think about your career here. So the message is, don't work harder. Don't do anything that's good for you. And I just don't know that men are receiving the same message. And if they are, I want to help them through that, because I don't want them to feel oppressed either by certain things. So I wanted to be here to make sure men know that like they are justified in wanting to understand themselves. And if you don't want to, or if that's not something that someone taught you is okay, I guess I wanted to say it's perfectly okay. And every fucking woman in your life wants you to. So,
yeah. You'll be a better man for it, right? And again, it's like the most heroic journey you can take is like the journey inwards, actually. And like trying to break these chains and becoming like fundamentally more human, ultimately.
Yeah, exactly. You get to be human also.
Yeah, so we got to wrap up here. It's a great conversation. I know you'll be back on in the future. But for those who want to find you online and learn more about you, where can they contact you?
My website is recovermecounseling.com. Phone number is probably easier because that just gets kind of, both are fine. Phone number is 720-551-5056, but look up the website.
recoverycounseling.com. Check it out. So thanks you all for tuning in to Men's Therapy Podcast. Great conversation as always. If you can think of a guy who needs to hear this conversation, please forward it to him, share it with him, sit down, listen to it with him, whatever it takes. You need to start to bust the stigma and get more men into treatment, into therapy, and just, doing this really powerful work for the good of everybody and for the good of themselves. So thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next week, another episode of Men's Therapy Podcast.
Thank you for joining your host, Mark Angele, on the Men's Therapy Podcast. Be sure to tune in again live next Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time and 11 a.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Empowerment Channel and anywhere podcasts are found. To support the show, leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. For more information or to apply to be a guest, visit www.menstherapypodcast.com.